What was Hitler's thinking about U-boats?
There's a moment where, he sort of realizes the strategic potential of the U-boat, but by that stage it's really too late. Horror of horrors, the British boarding party comes out to U-110 and starts pulling out the Enigma machine, pulling out all the code books. This is a huge boon for the British, absolutely huge. It's been lauded as, one of the great British naval victories, up there with Trafalgar. The conditions on a wartime U-boat just have to be, scarcely believed, frankly. I mean, they're astonishing. From 1943 to the end of the war, only 16% of them actually succeed in sinking anything at all. By 1945, statistically, a U-boat crew has a lifespan of less than one mission. So it literally is, statistically, a suicide mission.
TRIGGERnometry is proudly independent, and sponsors like Hillsdale College make that possible. Access their free library of world-class educational courses at hillsdale.edu/trigger.
Roger Moorhouse, welcome back to TRIGGERnometry.
My pleasure, thanks. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you back. I mean, you're one of our favorite historians, one of our favorite writers. You just really managed to bring history alive. Delighted to have you back to talk about your new book, which is, of course, about U-boats.
Yes.
Wolfpack. Yeah, brilliant. Looking forward to that. But we were joking around before we started. I was sort of saying, let's also aim for a non-autistic audience, which, to be fair, most of TRIGGERnometry's audience is autistic, so that's brilliant. But beyond that, non-male, non-nerdy autistic audience. Yeah. So we'll talk about a bunch of things related to that. But I've just finished actually reading Churchill's Diaries of World War II. Mm. And he talks about the fact that in the early phases of World War II, the threat that U-boats posed was just colossal, and British shipping and American shipping, but particularly British shipping, just took huge losses. How powerful a force was the U-boat in the early phases of World War II? Yeah,
it's a very good question. You kind of come to the heart of it there, Konstantin. I think this is one of those elements that's actually a bit overplayed in the historiography. I do, and I make this argument in the book. I think when Churchill makes that, or when he's talking about that, he's writing in his memoir, but he's talking about the period, what the Germans used to call the happy time. That was their first period of, scoring really high sort of sinking rates against Allied convoys and so on. So it's kind of the second half of 40 up until maybe early 42, that sort of period. And it's the period before the Americans come into the war. Mm-hmm. The Americans come into the war in December of 41, and they really sort of come on stream with Liberty ships and all of that through 43. So it's crucially before that period. That turns the tide, really, begins to turn the tide. So in that first happy time, there was a genuine concern in Allied circles that this could, strangle Britain. And that was the intention, was to, essentially knock out Britain's supply lines, take Britain out of the war, at least force London to negotiations. So that's always the intention. And I think there was a genuine fear, and there was a concern in that period that if you sink enough ships, then, Britain would be forced to at least sort of tighten belts that are already tight by that stage, and restrict rationing and all that sort of thing. So I think there was a concern that was genuine, but it was fairly short-lived. And by the time the Americans come in, that sort of evaporates. And then really from 43 onwards, the tables turn enormously against the U-boat arm. So the U-boats are effectively, sitting ducks really from 43 onwards. And you don't really see that, I think, unless you kind of see it from their perspective, which is what I tried to do with the book, trying to sort of shift that perspective. That the idea of us being under genuine threat for the full maybe 6 years of the war, I think is overblown. There was a small moment when it was a threat, and during that period, the Germans didn't have the numbers to make it count. Mm-hmm. By the time they had the numbers, the moment had gone. So I think that quote has been used like way too much. I know they use it on the book as well, but it's been used way too much, and I think it's kind of nudged the debate in a direction that has become a little bit sort of stereotypical.
Well, that's interesting. And so you talk about seeing things from the Germans, the enemy's perspective. What was Hitler's thinking about U-boats? Was he thinking this is our wonder weapon? He had a lot of those. We'll talk about them later on. That's going to strangle the Englanders, or was it just part of the arsenal? What was his thinking about
Yeah, he doesn't really think about the U-boats much at all, actually, until late 41, really. There's a moment where, he sort of realizes the strategic potential of the U-boat. Much too late. Dönitz who was the head of the U-boat arm, he'd been arguing for, a large U-boat force and for the reallocation of material and resources to the creation of U-boats, for years, before the war even, and had struggled, as everyone else did within the sort of Nazi hierarchy, to get Hitler's ear and to get those raw materials. Hitler didn't really have much of an interest in the U-boat arm as a weapon of war. He was much more continentally minded. He wanted to build tanks. He wanted to build surface ships as well, of course. So lots of money into those. Ultimately was proved to be pretty much a waste of money. But U-boats wasn't really on his agenda until 41, when after that period I talked about, the happy time, Churchill, excuse me.
It's easy to get them confused
nowadays. Sometimes.
Having a Biden moment.
So Hitler then, suddenly becomes a sort of convert for sending all his resources to the U-boat war. But by that stage, it's really too late.
And it's so fascinating you say that, because a Russian-Ukrainian historian that I follow, he talks about the fact, obviously, as you know, in the Soviet Union, everyone thinks that the Soviet Union won World War II alone. British people, as I've discovered, tend to think the same about Britain. Americans tend to think this. Everyone thinks that. But one of his counter-arguments to that is actually the total tonnage of the U-boats produced during World War II was greater than the total tonnage of the tanks that were produced by Germany in World War II. So the resource investment was immense, comparatively speaking. And if you think...
But it came too late.
But it came too late, is your point.
Yeah, that's the point. So, Dönitz always argued, even pre-war, he argued for a force of 300 U-boats, which meant that he could keep 100 in the field at any one time. You'd have 100 refitting or resupplying, you'd have 100 basically going to and from, but you could keep 100 in theatre. That was the logic. He goes to war in 1939 with 27 combat ocean-going U-boats. Right? There's nothing like the force that he wanted. So you can see what the shortages that he faced. He didn't get his 300 U-boat force until the end of 1942, by which time it's too late. Because the countermeasures are developed much more effectively on the Allied side. By 43, you've got the closing the Atlantic gap, so there's nowhere for U-boats to hide in the Atlantic. So the game's effectively over by early 43. So by that time it's too late.
And let's just, because in the book you talk about there's three main sections to the U-boat war during World War II. Let's focus on that first section, because it was very interesting reading about it, because these U-boat commanders and the servicemen who were working were very well trained. In fact, some of them were celebrities, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So those that scored the sort of biggest figures, came back home with their cheekbones glistening in the sunlight, and the victory pennants flying, and they were treated as celebrities. Absolutely, they were sent on lecture tours. There were articles about them in the newspapers. They were huge, those characters. So people like Günther Prien, Joachim Schepke, for example. These are absolutely Nazi heroes. They were printing postcards to be distributed to the Hitler Youth Boys. The next generation of U-boat sailors, really. So, and that's the intention, is to, obviously you're lauding your own successes in a way, but at the same time you need to get the next generation to sign up for the Navy.
But that also posed a real challenge for Goebbels and the rest of the propaganda department, because when the war started to turn and a lot of these men were starting to die and the U-boats were being sunk, all of a sudden that presented a real challenge, didn't it?
Yeah, and it is a genuine problem. You've got a generation of boys, and by the middle of the war onwards, it is sort of 18-year-old boys who are going to war. The average age of those killed in the U-boat army during World War II is 22, which is quite astonishing.
Is that different to other services?
I think it's probably pretty similar, given especially the huge death tolls from the middle of the war onwards, and you see the same thing in the land war. I remember seeing a stat about the German losses, particularly after the summer of 44, in that last almost year of the war, and they're astonishingly high. And again, the age profile is coming down all the time because they're using ever younger soldiers to conscript. So I think it's probably similar, but still, I mean, it's a remarkable,
of course,
rather hideous fact. But yes, you've got a generation of boys who are have been fed that propaganda of this sort of glorious experience of sinking shipping, and they're going out to conditions that are absolutely unthinkably hideous. And the more I sort of researched this and looked into these first-hand accounts, the conditions on a wartime U-boat just have to be scarcely believed, frankly. I mean, they're astonishing.
Tell us about that.
Incredibly cramped. So your standard wartime U-boat was what was known as a Type 7. It's about 66 meters long, but if in terms of habitable space, if you imagine two underground carriages, it's about that. That would have
how many people?
That would have a crew of 50, right? Plus engines, all the control mechanisms, all of the rest of it. And of course torpedoes, probably 14 torpedoes. So the ordinary men kind of sleep amongst the torpedoes, in hammocks and bunks and so on. So they're all on top of each other all the time, constantly. They're out for a single patrol would be anything up to about 8 weeks, usually. In that period, they had fresh food for probably about 2 weeks, and they had tinned food, which brought with it challenges, not least scurvy. So that became a problem for them. And they essentially didn't wash. So the crew would, their fresh water was rationed, so you could wash with seawater if you wanted to. Most people didn't. So this sort of image that we have, this sort of romantic image which you see in Das Boot, for example, of the sort of luxuriously bearded U-boatman, that came with a stink because they basically stank. They'd been away for 8 weeks, perhaps. One change of underwear was permitted. So you could smell them before you saw them, right? So the beard was a sort of a signifier of the fact, basically, they hadn't washed and hadn't shaved, probably for 8 weeks. So this U-boat stink is a thing, and you can see that it comes across in many of the accounts. And it's a unholy combination of BO, halitosis, scurvy brings on, gingivitis and the rest of it. That brings on pretty horrible halitosis. Diesel is everywhere. In a U-boat, you've got 2 massive diesel engines going pretty much all the time. And of course, mold. So you've got mold from everything is damp all the time. There's no facilities for drying anything, so everything is wet all the time. And of course, vomit, seasickness. So if you imagine that as one entity, that's the U-boat stink. And there are examples of U-boats coming into port and sort of flipping the conning tower hatch, and the shore crew actually recoiling in horror because of the stench that comes out of the thing. So it's a pretty grim story.
And there's also as well, there's a very funny moment in the book where it talks about venereal disease.
Yeah.
And in particular, the different ways certain captains approach that particular issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, it was a common thing. I mean, it was particularly after the fall of France.
If you're having lunch while listening to this, I apologize.
So after the fall of France, 1940, the Germans have access to the Brittany ports and plus Bordeaux, much quicker access to the western approaches. So for them it's win-win. But of course, you've then got a generation of young U-boatmen coming back from patrol with their wages burning a hole in their back pocket, going and visiting the young ladies of Lorient or Saint Malo or wherever it would be. A result of that, of course, is venereal disease of various sorts. And that's something that has to be very strictly controlled, of course, because, as always in a navy, it's a rather profound problem with morale and everything else and hygiene, to sort of keep everyone safe and well. And they have various methods of dealing with it. Very strict punishments, incidentally, for contracting venereal disease in the German Navy. And no less strict where they track down the source of the infection. So the ladies themselves would usually be tracked down and punished as well. But there's a couple of examples of people being inspected on the U-boats and being discovered to have whatever. I mean, even of the most, the benign end of the spectrum, stuff like pubic lice. That if you're found to have pubic lice, you could expect to be stuck in a storeroom, for an extended spell, just to keep you out of circulation, because everyone's hot bunking. So as soon as that gets amongst a crew, you've got a problem. It'll spread like wildfire. So PTSDs, absolutely. Sorry, that's wrong. STDs, absolutely, was a profound problem.
But I'm actually glad that you mentioned PTSD, because this is a thing that we don't talk about enough, is that the human suffering for those U-boatmen, not only physically, not only the ones who lost their lives, but psychologically and mentally. Just talk a little bit about how long you could be under the water, what impact did it have on the people?
Yeah, PTSD is one of those aspects, I think, that has not been talked about in this context, I think, at all, really. And it's one that sort of struck me when I started looking in the archive at contemporary medical records. And there are a few German Navy doctors who started looking into this. They had no support from above, because the Nazi regime wasn't interested. Didn't want to, in a sense, damage the sort of heroic image of the German military man and military élan. So it wasn't interested in sort of pursuing this as an idea and as a subject of research. And most of the men didn't want to admit to it either. So you can see that these doctors were really sort of, had a somewhat Sisyphean task in trying to research it. But they say themselves, this is the tip of an iceberg. What they found was the tip of an iceberg. And they estimate that about half of U-boatmen are suffering from some form of PTSD, all the way from, the shakes or sleeplessness or, nervous agitation, all the way to sort of suicidal thoughts. And there is a case of a commander commits suicide during a depth charge attack, for example. That's one end of the spectrum. But the stress that they're under, I think it's more so than any other branch really of the military, because of the confined nature of what they're doing. So you can imagine the stress of being an infantryman, for example, must be considerable during those periods when you're under attack, or if you're attacking. But then you have long periods of essentially doing not very much. There's that old line about warfare being 90% boredom, 10% terror. Mm-hmm. In that 90% period, you can relax a bit. You can allow that mental toll to dissipate somewhat. I think in the U-boat war, and particularly from the middle of the war onwards, when it becomes much more intense and they become very much the hunted rather than the hunters, the Allied tactic at that point was what they called hunting them to exhaustion. So you would have a U-boat would try and, or perhaps in a wolf pack, would try and attack a convoy. Very often they'd be pounced on by the escorts, and the escorts would not let them escape. So they had ASDIC, so they could basically keep contact with them at all times. They would force them down below the surface. They'd be depth charged. They could be depth charged for 24 hours, at which point the U-boat is at the limits of what it can, of how long it can dive. So it has to surface to, allow some air into the boat for one thing, but also to run the engine so it can charge its own batteries. So if it can't get away, it's going to have to come up, and then it's going to be shot to pieces and be forced to scuttle and surrender. So that's the standard format of it. But very often, that 24 hours of being constantly depth charged, perhaps by 2 or 3 destroyers, the mental toll of that, and the feeling of helplessness that I think they had, of being in this steel tube when that any impact closer than perhaps 15-20 meters from the hull would be sufficient for catastrophic damage, and then there's only one way they're going down. The sort of the horror of that, and the protracted nature of those attacks, I think that was enough to trigger profound psychological damage in a lot of these individuals.
And actually, in Das Boot, you see that there is that scene, isn't there, when the captain nearly shoots one of the guys who he thinks is being a mutineer or whatever is failing to obey orders.
But there's a few examples of during depth charge attacks, even officers kind of wide-eyed in terror, kind of running through the boat, and not knowing what to do. And that spreads very quickly throughout the crew, because the crew naturally look to the officers for leadership, guidance, all of that. And if the officers are panicking, then that spreads very quickly. So, once you accept, as I did from having read the archival investigations in this, once you accept that PTSD is a thing, then you start to see it in a lot of the memoirs, and you can see it. There's cases, a radio operator who loses the ability to speak, for example, after a depth charge attack. There are so many examples where, okay, that's what that is, and you can piece it all together. There was one commander, for example, that used to avoid contact at every opportunity, which is not cowardice, because he'd already sort of proven that the fact that he could do the job of a U-boat commander earlier in the war. But by that stage, he's actively avoiding contact with enemy shipping. He's asking to be transferred out of the U-boat arm. Eventually, he's shot for his troubles. But it's a clear case of PTSD in retrospect.
If you've been following the immigration debate, you'll know how different the headlines can look depending on where you get your news. We use ground news to help us step outside the echo chamber. It shows you how the same story is framed differently across the political spectrum, so you can compare headlines and decide for yourself. Take the story about a massive immigration raid at a Hyundai plant in Georgia, USA. Follow along at ground.news/triggernometry. Using ground news, straight away we can quickly see that the story is being covered by outlets across the board. However, scrolling down the page, ground news allows me to easily compare the headlines. We can see CNN, which is firmly on the left, highlighted that nearly 500 workers were taken, while Fox News, on the right, framed the raid as bold action. Ground news shows us that broadly, left-leaning outlets focused on immigrants and workers, centre-leaning outlets simply reported the number detained, and right-leaning outlets emphasised illegal workers. Ground news compiles these divergent perspectives into one place. Another feature we use heavily at Trigonometry is their blind spot feed, which shows you where coverage is lopsided, lets you compare headlines across the political spectrum, and helps you identify what's being emphasised or ignored. If you care about getting to the truth by seeing things from all angles, ground news is essential. Go to ground.news/triggernometry and get 40% off their unlimited Vantage plan. That's the plan we use. That link again is ground.news/triggernometry.
Why does, you mentioned the three sections, the happy days, then it turns again. What makes that first turn happen? Why do the U-boats not prove to be as successful as might be hoped, certainly for the Germans? Why does that pivot happen?
I think the first failure, if you like, to capitalize is numbers, as I said before. The Germans just do not have the numbers to maximize that opportunity that they're given. They have the opportunity. British Institute convoy operations already at the beginning of the war. They had done so at the end of the First World War, so there was nothing necessarily new about that. But it didn't really, in terms of the defensive operations, it didn't really get into its swing properly, probably until late 41 maybe. So there was a window when the British are not quite yet up to speed. You don't have, for example, the benefit of reading German cipher traffic, which comes in later on as well, after sort of late 40, 41. You start to get German cipher traffic being read by Bletchley Park. So you've got that. There is an opportunity. The Americans are not yet in, as I explained earlier on, but the Germans don't have the numbers to realize it, to make that work. So that's the sort of the initial failure. So yes, they score high figures, but they're not able to score high enough figures to do what they want to do, which is effectively knock Britain out of the war. So then you get to 1942 onwards, effectively that sort of pivot moment, 1942, 42, 43, which is where the Allied game improves drastically. So the Americans come in, you've got more in the way of manpower, you've got more in the way of escorts. Enigma traffic is coming on stream much more consistently by that stage. So
and tell us about that, because I didn't know this, but that actually came from a U-boat.
Yes,
the machine
was
captured.
From
I didn't know
U-110. Yeah.
Tell us about what happened, because most people haven't heard of it.
Yeah. So as I said before, the standard practice, at least in the early phase of the war, was that a U-boat, if it was discovered by a destroyer, would be forced below the surface, of course, depth charged. If they were damaged in the process, or if they were just, exhausted their air, then they were forced to surface at some point. At which point, they would either try and fight it out on the surface, which they could do. They had a deck gun and so on. Some of them did. Bit of a suicide mission against a destroyer, but some of them did. What was more usual was that you would surface, you'd kind of, white flag, and you'd evacuate the crew, and then the U-boat would be scuttled. So they'd pull the seacocks, and the U-boat would be scuttled. So that was kind of normal practice, and you can see that in a lot of the early engagements with the Royal Navy. You can see that from the archival record, was that death tolls are actually pretty minimal, but it's always that maybe a small proportion of the crew are killed. Most of them survive, go into British captivity, and the U-boat is scuttled.
And it's scuttled to prevent sensitive equipment being captured,
Precisely.
the boat being captured,
Yeah,
etc.
precisely.
Yeah.
The example of U-110 is different in that respect because everything worked the same way. So they were forced to the surface. The captain decided to try and scuttle it, got his crew off. But for some reason, it didn't work. Either the order wasn't carried out to, pull the seacocks, or you had to open various levers to sort of let seawater in and so on. For some reason, that didn't happen. So the crew are all kind of floating away from this U-boat, which he's expecting to see, sink beneath the waves, and it doesn't. And then there's a, horror of horrors, a British boarding party comes out to U-110 and starts, rifling through everything, pulling out the Enigma machine, pulling out all the code books. This is a huge boon for the British, absolutely huge. I mean, it's been lauded as, one of the great British naval victories, up there with Trafalgar. And in terms of the significance for what comes later on, I think that's probably not mistaken. That's not misplaced.
And how come the Germans didn't realize this? The Germans back home, hadn't realized that this had happened.
It was kept pretty secret. And they had the whole thing that there's a huge operation on the British side to prevent the Germans from realizing that Enigma was being read all the way through the war and in all theatres. So there's an interesting example, I think, in the Mediterranean, where Enigma had told them that a certain German ship was in a certain place in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was duly sunk. And then, so as to make sure that the Germans kind of didn't realize that we knew what was going on, where this was going to be, they sent out reconnaissance planes, just so that from the German side, the narrative was, okay, it was spotted by the reconnaissance planes. So all the way through, there was always this maximum effort given to trying to sort of, shield the reality of ultra intelligence.
And talk to us about the Enigma machine, because people know the term but might not understand the significance of it. Just tell us the story of that from the beginning. What is it? What was it used for? Why was the discovery of it so significant?
Yeah, so
and the impact it had.
The Germans had been experimenting this. Initially, it was a commercial enterprise. They produced this cipher machine. And there are many similar machines going around in the 1920s and 30s. The Germans developed one, which was initially on the open market in the 1930s. It had been essentially, deconstructed and broken by Polish engineers and mathematicians before the war. And in the summer of 1939, so just before the outbreak of war, they handed over everything that they had worked out on the Enigma machine, which by then was the sort of standard encryption machine of the German military.
This is basically a way of preventing other hostile forces from getting your communications
exactly,
and knowing what's going on.
So we have now end-to-end encryption. It's kind of a common phrase these days. Yeah. That was a good example of end-to-end encryption. It was considered to be unbreakable. So it would encrypt the message that was typed into it. It looked like a typewriter, essentially, with a sort of plug board in the front of it. And you had a number of settings and a couple of dials that you had to set. So when you're setting it up for that particular day, you have a number of settings you're supposed to follow. Then it broadcasts basically nonsense, what looks like nonsense, but at the other end, with the same settings, you can decrypt it at the other end. So all that anyone is intercepting, if they're intercepting the message, is nonsense, is a series of letters. So it was considered unbreakable, and it was absolutely crucial for the British and others to make sure that assumption was never challenged by the Germans, and it wasn't, crucially. Interestingly, Dönitz, in his memoir, which came out in 1957, after he'd spent 10 years in prison, he talks in his memoir about, we still don't know if the British, broke Enigma. So he's still ignorant about it in 1957, which is kind of remarkable. So it was the great secret, even post-war. I think the story broke in the 70s in the end, which is remarkable. So the breaking of that, and it wasn't a sort of a one-hit thing where you break Enigma and then you're in forever, because of the different models. So the German Navy, for example, had a 4-rotor model, which was another element of another level of encryption, for example. Because the codes would change at regular intervals, it was quite possible for Bletchley Park, where all of this was done, to be locked out for a period and have to sort of re-break with the new codes. But they were always on top of it. So increasingly, as the war went on, those gaps where they were locked out grew less and less and of less duration. So, crucially for the Allies in the U-boat war, the knowledge of where the German wolf packs were, for example, meant that they could, direct convoys around them. So initially, in a defensive capacity, you could use Enigma traffic in that way. And then later on, in a much more offensive capacity, you could actually target individual vessels or target individual wolf packs. And there's a great example of a supply ship. They had these things like Type 14, which was a supply U-boat, which is much bigger than the Type 7. And it could, it would patrol the Atlantic basically and liaison with its attack U-boats, and they would get fuel, they would get torpedoes, they'd get food, and then they'd go for another 2-3 weeks. So actually, meaning that they didn't have to cross back across the Atlantic back to France to be resupplied. So brilliant piece of logistics and brilliant piece of technology. When the British realised that that's what the Germans were doing with these Type 14s, they started targeting the Type 14s. And there's one example, I think it was U-489, on its maiden voyage, comes out of port, goes through the North Sea, down through the mid-Atlantic. It's being watched all the way via Enigma. And it's destroyed, within, a couple of weeks of leaving port. Never has a rendezvous with any of its attack U-boats. It's on its maiden voyage. This is indicative of how the war had turned, was that in some instances like that, we could literally know where it was at all times and attack it accordingly and destroy it. So
that's incredible.
They didn't have a chance.
The impact of Enigma must have been so big because you literally got access to the enemy's communications. It's extraordinary achievement.
Effectively. And it's not, like I said before, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
And it is sometimes halting and sometimes you get locked out. But yeah, absolutely. You have access to their communications, quite right.
And it also had a devastating effect on German and U-boat morale, didn't it?
It did. And more so actually, that in that respect, the Germans never knew that Enigma had been broken, as I said before. But the fact that they're being destroyed in such numbers and kind of inexplicably as well.
It's probably even worse for morale because you don't know why,
so
but you're suddenly getting your ass handed
so you
to
you get all of these, sort of conspiracy theories going around. Mm-hmm. One interesting example in this.
Was it about the Jews?
Not that one.
So you don't have the machine? Oh, nine.
No, there's an interesting story of one of the other innovations that really changed the game is the advent of airborne radar for the British. So that bombing vessels, bombers, for example, armed with aerial radar, you can read where a U-boat is from about sort of 5-6 miles out. You could be on top of it and bombing it within but they will spot you. They've got 30 seconds to dive. A good U-boat crew can dive in 25 seconds. So it's touch and go. That's much more effective than, trying to track them and attack them via a destroyer, right? Because you can see them on the horizon. You can travel pretty much as fast as they can in a U-boat. So that's, it's quite easy to get away. You can't escape a, attacking aircraft. So they had these radar detectors on the U-boats, which would sort of ping when they'd been spotted on radar, it would ping. But then when the radar set was updated by the British and changed to a different frequency, then it stopped pinging. So then they're going, well, how are we still being detected and this isn't working? So then they come to the conclusion that their machine must be actually betraying their presence to the British, right? So this becomes the narrative for the U-boat crew. So they start switching them off entirely, which is kind of suicidal, because then they don't know when they're being read at all. So it's really, that again, that's as a conspiracy theory is really kind of catastrophic for the U-boat crews. And that's one of the ways that, the stress of that situation, how it manifests itself in irrational decision-making. So you've got individual commanders going, so turn the bloody thing off, it's betraying our position. This is the commander saying that. So it's the stress we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that it did is that it meant that so many U-boats got wiped out. So many U-boat commanders got wiped out. And this is obviously catastrophic because of the loss of life. But more pertinently, it's the loss of experience that the U-boats, the loss of experience, it was catastrophic, wasn't it, really?
Because you have at least 3 generations of U-boat crews and commanders. The first phase that we talked about earlier, when they actually are pretty competent, they're doing what they have to do. They're short on numbers, they're short on U-boats, they're short on crew, but they're pretty competent. That's the first happy time. That generation, very often they had pre-war naval experience, both the men and the commanders.
And the technology that you talked about in the book. There was a U-boat from 1935.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're they're pretty long in the tooth, a lot of them. Someone like Gunter Prien that sank the Royal Oak in 1939. He'd been in the German Merchant Marine in the early 1930s, right? So he had been a sailor for a long, long time. Tremendous amount of experience. By the time they're killed off, and like Gunter Prien is killed in March of 41. By the time they're killed off, you've got their deputies and their sort of officer corps become the next commanders, and they're reasonably competent, but they don't have the same degree of experience, nowhere near. So already in about 41, a lot of the interrogation reports from the British, and the British, as I said before, when they capture these crews, really extensive interrogation procedure that they go through, and they're saying in many cases already in 41 and beyond that they're astonishingly inexperienced. Some of them had only been in the U-boat force, for a couple of months. Their training had been perfunctory. Their morale was really low. This is already 41, like really early, when you'd think that Germany is still in the phase of sweeping all before it. Certainly in the land war, but morale is really fragile in the U-boat arm, and it's partly because of that inexperience. It's partly because these young men, have not got that long tail of experience. By the time you get to the end phase of the war, you've got commanders who are 22, 23 years old, commanding a U-boat, who weren't even in the Navy at the beginning of the war, right? Who have had a really shortened training regimen for themselves and their crews. And essentially the question is, do they actually know what they're doing? And the figures for that period, it's obviously, this is one factor among many, but the figures in terms of sinkings for the second half of the war are catastrophic for the Germans. Right? From 1943 onwards, of the 400 vessels launched from 1943 to the end of the war, only 16% of them actually succeed in sinking anything at all. 84% don't sink anything.
Wow.
From 43 onwards. So you can see how the game shifts.
How often do you get the chance to access a world-class education for free? That is exactly what Hillsdale College is offering with its new online course, Athens and Sparta. Few rivalries in history have left as deep a mark as Athens and Sparta. One was a birthplace of democracy, philosophy and art. The other built a culture of strength, unity and sacrifice. Dive in today at hillsdale.edu/trigger. Over 9 lectures, distinguished historians Victor Davis Hanson and Paul Ray guide you through the triumphs and failures of these cities, from the Greek victory in the Persian War, which secured freedom and democracy in the West, to the devastating Peloponnesian War that brought Athens' golden age to an end. You'll get access to all of the lectures, course readings and quizzes completely free. Enroll today at hillsdale.edu/trigger. That's hillsdale.edu/trigger. And the game also shifts as well because, look, the technology, it's not very good.
No.
I think there was a stat: 30% of torpedoes failed to launch.
Yeah, that's the 1940. They had the torpedo crisis in the German military, in German Navy. This was made manifest particularly in the Norwegian campaign in spring of 1940. And yeah, you're right. So 1 in 3 torpedo firings fail, which means you might hit the target, but you'll just hear this sort of clunk as it hits the hull of the target ship. Won't actually explode. And it actually that was only solved by capturing a British submarine and then retro-engineering the detonators on the British torpedoes, and then refitting those to German torpedoes. But yeah, the technology is really quite primitive. The Type 7, as I said, the backbone of the fleet, is essentially an updated version of the U-boat from the end of the First World War, which was called the UB3. Right? Various technological advances have been made, but it's essentially the same thing. So really quite primitive, mass-produced, did the job. It's a submersible rather than a submarine. It spends most of its time on the surface. Only dives to either attack or to avoid attack. So it's a very primitive vessel. And again, the example of the torpedoes is a good one. That shows as well how primitive they were and how fallible they were as well.
That's quite unusual, isn't it? Because especially towards the end of the war, Hitler in particular is staking a lot of his resources on super weapons. The idea that we're going to build something that's going to fundamentally shift the course of the war, which we're clearly at this point losing.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm speaking for we, the Germans.
Freudian, mate.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully I can get away with that. But you know what I mean. But what you're saying is they really didn't do that with the U-boats.
Well, they did.
They did.
So the core of the U-boat fleet, which is these Type 7s, about 70%, and then Type 9s was a larger vessel, which also pretty primitive, but worked very well. So they did from 43 onwards. There's this very, very analogous actually to the wonder weapons that you just mentioned, the V1s, V2s and everything else. They started looking at the next generation of submarines, of U-boats. And what should it look like? What propulsion systems, for example, should it have that would enable it to stay beneath the surface either for longer periods or even indefinitely? And the conventional form of having diesel engines, and electric batteries and so on, that was considered old hat. Let's not do that because that means we have to surface, which means we're vulnerable. So they start looking at various propulsion systems. There's a German engineer called Walter who was like not really a charlatan because he was a bit brilliant, but he led them down a number of dead ends in terms of things like the propulsion systems that were independent of air, essentially. So creating propulsion systems that would work perpetually underwater. So they put an awful lot of money into that. And then there's two generations of U-boats at the end. This is electrically powered. So huge battery packs underneath them, a bit like your electric vehicle today. Type 21s, Type 23s, which they produce essentially from 44 onwards exclusively. Right, so all the order book for the Type 7s is kind of, okay, we won't build those anymore. We're going to build these ones, and that's they're radically different. Particularly the Type 21s, which is the ocean-going version. It points in many respects. It points to a lot of the technology and the technological developments that you'll see in the Cold War. So a really fascinating vessel, but it consumed huge amounts of manpower, man-hours, raw materials, steel, all the rest of it. They had more than 100 of these built at the end of the war. Not one of them saw combat.
Wow.
Right? Because they're constantly, fighting teething troubles and difficulties to actually get them, up to speed. So for the second half of the war, you've got the same thing. You've got these sort of wonder weapons and all of the faith being put in the wonder weapons. And there's a Goebbels' diary entry, which I quote, where he talks about, if we can get these on stream, by June 1945, he's talking about June 45, this is going to change the war. It's a very similar story to the V2s, except the V2s actually were used in anger. The Type 21s never were. But in a sense, it's difficult with a counterfactual, but you almost sense, had they put all of that effort into just producing more Type 7s or more Type 9s, the tried and tested vessels that they had, they might have, done better, should we say, in the latter half
I was
of the
going to
war.
ask you about the done better thing. Is a really interesting point because I mean, Churchill talks about it this as well. I mean, Hitler made a hell of a lot. Look, everybody makes mistakes, especially in in that sort of situation, particularly when you look back at it, it's with full knowledge of everything. But do you think that if the Germans hadn't obsessed about making these, it's interesting. I mean, I think, confessing to being both a nerd and autistic in this conversation, but I watch like people restoring World War II weapons on YouTube. There's some channels that do way bigger numbers than us, by the way, mate. But a lot of them talk about the fact that, this is a German submachine gun and it's like way more complicated than a Russian one or an American one or a British one. Do you think if the Germans had focused more on mass production, they would have, I probably wouldn't have won, but do you think they would have had a much better chance in the war?
Yes, I don't think it would necessarily change the end result.
Yeah.
Because of what you're facing, but certainly after 41, you're facing the industrial might, not only of the United States, and the best example there is Liberty ships in this context. They're producing Liberty ships, almost by the week in US shipyards. So they're more than replacing what's being lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. And on the other side, you've got the Soviet Union, which is very good at this stuff, at actually mass production. Look at the T-34. They concentrate on one model of tank effectively for most of the war, until the end of the war when you've got some others, JS-1, for example, JS-2s. But most of the war, they're producing T-34s. And it's pretty primitive. It's very effective, but pretty primitive in its... If you want nerdery, go to Bovington
I've been in a T-34. It's not comfortable.
No. When back in the day, I've done a bit of welding in my time, Konstantin. It might surprise you. If you look at the welds on a German Panther, like they're perfect.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind, the thickness of the steel, it's very tough to actually get a decent weld. The welds are all perfect. If you look at the welds on a T-34, they're catastrophically bad. But they used it basically as a throwaway weapon, and you've always got another one. The Germans never had another one. They never had another Panther. They couldn't throw them away in the same way. So. Absolutely, I think that could have maybe prolonged the war from a German perspective. I don't think it would have changed the result because of the sheer disparity in the economic potential of the two partners.
But it was when you were talking about towards the end of the war, where they were still building U-boats, and the Nazi leaders were going, look, well, we can't just focus this on one factory because we're getting killed out here. So we've got to do it in 2 or 3 factories.
Yeah.
So then what would happen is then you stuck it all together.
And it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the story of the Type 21, effectively. That's why the Type 21 spent, the first Type 21 is actually launched in the summer of 1944. So it could have potentially made a difference. But it spent so long in sort of troubleshooting and trying to find out why it leaks and why it does this and the other. And it's exactly what you said, is because of the aerial campaign against Germany, against German factories, they had basically kind of dissipated production and said, okay, well, this factory over here is going to do the tail sections. There's 8 sections, I think, to a Type 21. So, each section was going to be built at a different place, and then they pull them all together and they'd essentially assemble the finished article. And the intention, obviously, is that, with the bombing campaign, if one of those, gets temporarily knocked out, it doesn't knock out the whole thing. So you can kind of work around the bombing campaign. But the end result, and of course you're using slave labor, using concentration camp labor. So, they're not bothered what the tolerances are. They're too busy, worrying about where the next meal is coming from. They're not going to get beaten to death by a guard. So,
also, they fucking hate you.
Yeah, and they hate you. So sabotage is a thing as well. Yeah. So there's that. So the sections that are built are very often built not to tolerances, and they don't find out until they try and put them all together. And they actually try and go and float it in the Baltic, and it doesn't work. So this is why they spent, more than a year very often in troubleshooting, never saw action.
Was there ever a conversation, you talked about the stat, 16% never sank anything. Was there ever a conversation of like, boys, this isn't working. How about we, look, at this point, we're getting absolutely smashed here. Let's put this steel into anti-aircraft guns so that our cities don't get flattened. Let's actually redistribute these resources to something that's going to defend our country, as opposed to like trying to win the war that's no longer winnable. Was there ever, or was Hitler just too deranged by this point? And he was like, we're going to win. And
I think, 43 is a, the more you look at the progress of the war, 43 is the sort of tipping year, it's the tipping point of the war. The summer of 43 essentially Germany comes to the same position that it was at the end of the First World War, which is that, sane heads would have told them that we may not yet have lost, but we can't win. So you've got, the Battle of the Atlantic is effectively lost May 43. North Africa is lost May 43. Mm-hmm. You've got Italy falling out of the war in September. Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front is huge. Bombing of Hamburg.
Right. Well, this is the
all
thing.
Of that happens in that summer.
Well, this was the point I was going to make. But people don't recognize this because we think of battles as individual things. But while the Battle of Kursk is going on, this great decisive battle, German cities are getting flattened.
Yeah.
And you're thinking this Battle of Kursk is miles away from Germany. If you actually care about Germans, you'd be like, let's consolidate, maybe let's sue for peace.
Yeah.
But
my point is, at the end of the First World War, they got to an analogous situation where they realized they haven't yet been defeated, but they can no longer win. And that's when they sued for peace at the end of the First World War. The difference in the Second World War is that you have an ideology which is kind of, fundamentally kind of millenarian, and it's
right.
The added element of the racial element, the ideological element, particularly on the Eastern Front, that you can never make terms with the Soviets. That means effectively they're going to fight for another 2 years. So by that, essentially by 43, the war's it's more or less done.
The outcome is clear.
But because of that ideological element, the derangement, as you put it, I mean, Hitler, he's not technically deranged as in insane, but he's ideologically off with the
you know
pixies.
what I mean, though, because when you're making decisions that are not in the interest of your country and your people, by that point, or even strategically correct, right? Because if say you are the leader of a country, and if you look at objectively the situation, you know that the war can't be won. And let's say you want to continue fighting, you would at least do everything you possibly can to throw those resources into protecting your country, your people, your cities from being wiped off the map.
Out.
And instead, what he's doing is telling everyone to stand to the last man and miles away and doing all these crazy things. So that's what I mean by deranged. I just mean someone who's making very, very bad decisions.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see that where there is a shift after 43, it's not in terms of, protecting the homeland at all. It's towards what we said before about, wonder weapons, and that becomes the focus, which is, okay, we can't win in the conventional form, so we're gonna try these, novel weapons, whether it be V1s, V2s, or these Type 21s, whatever it is. And there are some innovations that you can see in that period, particularly, in the U-boat war as well, which are of note. There's this stuff Alberich, this sort of covering, this rubber covering that they put on U-boats, so they were effectively immune to ASDIC and sonar detection, which is kind of fascinating. And as I said, it presages a lot of the developments of the later Cold War. So stuff like that is really fascinating. But there's it's much more offensive in nature. And I think that comes down to the ideology, that they're still ideologically addled, that you can't possibly, just sort of focus in and protect the people. It has to be offensive all the time.
And why is that, Roger? I mean, obviously there's a more modern context in which sort of someone has been in charge for a very long time, can't get the feedback, etc. Is that part, by this point, has Hitler cleaned house of anyone who would tell him, Mein Führer, this might not be a good idea? Yeah. Is that what's happening, or are they all true believers, or like why?
It's a bit of both. So there's certain, any of those, dissenting voices or potentially dissenting voices within the high command and the upper echelons of politics have been effectively removed or moved to safety, as it were. And also even those that, there are numerous accounts of generals, for example, who in the field will see a particular scenario, a particular catastrophe, and will say, well, I'm going to go and confront the Fuhrer and tell him this is how it has to be. And they go to Hitler, and Hitler does have this weird charisma, is the only word for
magnetism.
It. Is a magnetism. And there are very few people within the sort of upper echelons of the Third Reich that are immune to it. One of them being Klaus von Stauffenberg, for example, who, he talks about, I think in one of his letters, he talked about going to see the Fuhrer and being being mindful that this was the narrative, was that he had these sort of piercing blue eyes and all of this stuff, and he was a very, very, extremely persuasive character, very difficult to contradict. And he said after that first meeting, he said, I looked into his eyes, I shook his hand, there was nothing. Like, he didn't feel the magnetism. Most people, the vast majority, did.
Stauffenberg, by the way, is the guy behind Operation Valkyrie,
exactly,
who tried to kill Hitler in 1944. I believe,
yeah.
Operation Valkyrie, great movie, by the way.
Yes,
Valkyrie,
yes,
very, very good. Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
Carry on, sorry.
But he's a minority, Stauffenberg, in not feeling that, in not sensing that. The vast majority, even those sort of, reasonably coherent and independent-minded generals who see a problem and say, right, I'm going to go and confront the Führer, they will come out of their meeting with the Führer saying, the Führer's right, we have to do this, and they're sort of back on stream. So that combination, I think, of, like you said, cleaning house is a good phrase on the one hand, and also just that sheer magnetism that he seemed to have.
Do you know what strikes me about that? It's so weird, Roger, isn't it? Because when I think of the Germans, particularly in that period, they are an intensely pragmatic people. They're practical, they're hands-on, like we talked about, their engineering is incredible, they're thinking about, and yet they are so captured by an ideology and also one man.
Yeah.
Isn't it incredible?
It is, and I agree. It's kind of, the two almost contradict each other, right? Because you said there is that tremendous pragmatism and technological nous, and that base is astonishing in Germany. But at the same time, certainly in the upper echelons, absolute ideological capture, which was impossible to escape effectively, within the regime. So, anyone that dissented, you'd be shuffled out to some sinecurial post or worse. So there was no way to really sort of effect any change within the regime at all. And that's one of the reasons, behind the assassination attempts as well.
And it was very interesting because you touch on it in the book, in that there was a little bit more free speech in the U-boats, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Because you're a crew, you're a team, you were isolated, so people could speak a little bit more freely, couldn't they, about what they thought about Hitler and where the war was going?
I mean, this is one of the things that surprised me, actually, was how, I can't really use the word liberal, but comparatively liberal the regime was in the German Navy. And you can see in numerous kind of anecdotal accounts. There's one of a U-boat captain coming into port in France, and calling out to the welcoming crew on the quayside and saying, "Are the Nazis still in charge?" And someone shouts back and says, "Yes, they are." And then he puts the U-boat in reverse, and everyone laughs, right? It's like, okay, and you think, well, how did he get away with that? But he did, right? And everyone laughed, and they moved on. So once you and there's numerous accounts similar. I mean, German Navy, of course, like any branch of the military, is a cross section of German society. So you've got Nazis, you've got anti-Nazis, and you've got the mass in between that go with the flow, kind of believe, maybe not, whatever. That's reflected in the U-boat arm as well. Where it sort of seems peculiar is when, by the middle of the war, the Nazi regime is tightening up its political control, and particularly after the Stauffenberg assassination attempt in the summer of '44. You've got essentially political officers being used in the Wehrmacht, for example, like you had in the Soviet Union in the Red Army, to sort of ensure ideological conformity. That doesn't happen in the Navy, and it doesn't happen in the submarine arm either. And you have to ask why. And Dönitz, who is a Nazi, like, he believes, he's one of these guys that believes that Hitler is infallible, right? And yet he effectively blocks the sort of indoctrination measures that the High Command wants to institute in the Navy. And we have to ask why he does that. And I think there was a plausible explanation that I read that said essentially he viewed it as superfluous. It was unnecessary. Because his Navy, he effectively created the U-boat arm. That was his baby. As far as he was concerned, it was all ideologically on side. All his young men were fine, patriotic, upstanding Germans that wouldn't possibly dissent from the Nazi opinion and Nazi ideology. So all of this stuff is unnecessary. Not only is it unnecessary, it gets in the way. So he basically kind of allowed them to have their little indoctrination office, but he didn't allow any of their men on to ride along on the boats. Said there was no space, which is kind of true. So there's a sort of a brick wall, and it's not oppositional. It's basically saying, you guys are superfluous. We don't need you. We're already on side, right? But the end result is exactly as you describe, is I wouldn't say it's a haven necessarily, but it's certainly, less ideologically under the jackboot than perhaps other branches of the German military.
Hypnosis gets a bad rap, but it's not a gimmick. It's a legitimate therapeutic tool backed by research, and when it comes to weight loss, it can be a game changer. Hypnotio is a self-hypnotherapy app that helps you break bad eating patterns by working at the subconscious level, where the real habits live. It's for people who are done with willpower-only plans. Hypnotio helps you tackle emotional eating, stress-related cravings, and food anxiety using proven techniques that reduce cortisol, improve portion control, and build long-term habits. All in a way that fits into real life, from your phone, tablet, or your computer. Clinical studies show that users lost twice as much weight as those using traditional diets alone, and 94% maintained that weight loss more effectively over time. It's not about hacks, it's about fixing the deeper programming. Hypnosis-based programs reduce BMI and emotional eating significantly compared to standard diets. So what are you waiting for? Use our link in the description box and pinned comment and grab 15% off your first subscription.
Do you think part of it as well is, and you capture it wonderfully in the book, is a camaraderie between sailors, between the Allied sailors and the Nazi sailors?
Yeah. I mean, this is one, again, a surprise to me. I think there's a crucial point here that you have to make, which is the assumptions that are made on both sides once war breaks out. One of the sort of corollaries of war is that you have to, dehumanize the enemy. You have to be able to portray the enemy as a monster, someone who deserves to be killed, and it's your duty to do so because it's a brutal business. And as soon as you allow that dehumanization to slip, you've got a problem. But it's interesting in the U-boat war, in the initial phase, the opening 2 years of the war, perhaps. There are many more examples of U-boat crews helping those that they've just sunk. Than any sort of, maltreatment or atrocity or anything. There's only one documented war crime, incidentally, by the U-boat arm, which again astonished me. Now there may be some more that, all of the victims were killed. The U-boat crew themselves were sunk later on the mission, so there's no evidence. No one knows. There's no record. It's quite possible. But there's one documented atrocity, which was the machine gunning of survivors of the Peleus in 1944. There are many more examples of shipwrecked sailors being helped, being given food, being given blankets. There's even one crazy example where a U-boat sank I think it was a Greek steamer off the Irish coast, and then towed the lifeboats to the Irish coast. It took 24 hours, right? Which is insane when you think about it. They're in the middle of the war. I mean, they're towing survivors from the ship they just sunk. But it speaks to what you just mentioned, this idea of, the phrase I use in the book is the solidarity of the sea, which is a kind of a tradition that's older than Nazism and goes back generations. Even in wartime, the target is the ship. The target is the tonnage and the cargo. It's not necessarily the crew, right? And that idea, I think, permeates even into the U-boat arm, and I think quite a long way through the war. There's a really interesting case in 1942, September 42, the sinking of the Laconia, which is quite a well-known incident off the West African coast, where a passenger vessel was torpedoed by U-boats. The U-boat surfaces, in the aftermath, and they used to do this quite regularly. They'd come to the surface and sort of ask some of the survivors, what ship they were from, where they were headed, what the cargo was, et cetera, because they never really knew what the target was. That was normal. And when they did surface, it was U-156, they surfaced, and they realized that all the voices they heard were Italian, right? And they're allies, right? So it's carrying Italian POWs, this vessel, Laconia. So the decision is made to mount a rescue operation. So they start rounding up the floats, the debris, the survivors, pulling them all together. And there's Brits in there as well. They're all ordinary fare-paying passengers as well. And for 4 days, this commander of U-156 basically is herding together the surviving lifeboats and survivors from this sinking in mid-Atlantic. And he's radioing on Claire in English, unencrypted, I would stress, to say, anyone wants to come and help me, I won't fire on you if you won't fire on me, because we're having a bit of a catastrophe here. And in the end, he gets attacked by the Americans. So he's attacked by American aircraft and has to dive. He has survivors up on his deck, and he has to dive, leaves them in the sea. That is a big shock to the German naval community in World War II, right? So Dönitz reports this to Hitler. Hitler rages and says, well, why are they picking up survivors anyway? Right? So this is the ideological gulf. So for Hitler, it's about tonnage, yes, but it's also, he's saying shoot the crew. That's Hitler's viewpoint. You can see it, much more brutal. And Dönitz, to his credit, as I said, he doesn't deserve much credit, but in this occasion, to his credit, he pushes back and says, no, we're not going to do that, because that's not the way naval operations work. The end result is what's called the Laconia Order, where Dönitz orders that German crews from then on are not to assist shipwrecked sailors.
And
but I'm really glad that you brought up Dönitz, because he strikes me as this fascinating character. On the one hand, completely ideologically possessed a Nazi. On the other hand, you look at the way he's behaved, and he comes across as a man of integrity. At the end of the war, he goes to the Nuremberg trials, and that's another fascinating story.
Yeah, it is. He's a really interesting character, and I think he encapsulates it quite well. He combines those two, at first sight, quite kind of contradictory worldviews, if you like. He is a convinced Nazi. As I said, he adored Hitler. He thought Hitler was the best thing since whatever the last best thing was. But at the same time, he's a man from that naval tradition. So there, in moments like when he issues the Laconia Order and he has that argument with Hitler, he's trying to sort of combine those two worldviews in a satisfactory manner to himself and to his traditions. And the Laconia Order is an interesting one. I said from then on, the German Navy essentially had an order not to assist those that they'd sunk. Prior to 42, that was the norm, as far as it was possible. Very often it wasn't possible, but if it was possible, they tended to do it. At least, a couple of blankets. Land is that way. That would be the sort of the bottom line. From then on, that tails off very, very swiftly. So what is already a brutal conflict, a brutal theatre of the conflict, becomes all the more so.
Do the Allies reciprocate this?
Not particularly. No, there wasn't much in the way of, obviously there's no love lost. There's not much in the way of sort of atrocities committed the other way. There's one I know of in the Pacific War with the Americans, the USS Wahoo. They shot survivors of a Japanese merchantman. So that's kind of interesting in itself, but there's not really.
But if a U-boat surfaces,
yeah,
they will pick up the crew and let them scuttle it still.
As long as it surrenders itself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If it shapes to open fire and defend itself, then it's
that's a legitimate target, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so we're sticking with Dönitz then. So he's the head of the Navy throughout the entire war?
He's the head of the U-boat arm initially, and then from 43 he's the head of the Navy.
And what happens to him at Nuremberg?
So he's tried at Nuremberg as one of the principal, war criminals. He's indicted for, crimes against peace, and I think three charges at Nuremberg, and brilliantly argued actually by his lawyer, a chap called
Was he a Jewish lawyer?
No,
That'd be a hell of a plot twist.
It would, wouldn't it? No, he's an old former naval judge, stood as his lawyer, and actually quite effectively argued that the war that Dönitz had been conducting was very, very similar in its nature and its conduct to the naval war that the Allies had been conducting as well. So, and he had testimony, for example, from the US Admiral Chester Nimitz, essentially saying the same thing, that it wasn't possible to take, shipwrecked sailors on board. The best you could do was sort of point them in the direction of land and say good luck. and unrestricted, submarine warfare was kind of the norm. So he was basically forcing the prosecutors at Nuremberg to say, well, if you're going to damn Dönitz, you have to damn the Americans as well. He got 10 years at Nuremberg,
which is fairly light sentence.
Which is by Nuremberg standards exactly is quite light. I mean, he's not someone that deserves sympathy at all because of his political convictions. But I think, as you said before, there's a degree of integrity as a naval man that we should probably bear in mind when we make these judgments about Dönitz.
And one thing this is going off script a little bit, but I think it's a fascinating question to ask a historian who's as well informed about that conflict as you are. And a big question to ask too, what do you make of Nuremberg?
It's interesting. I think Nuremberg, there's a lot of complaints made about it being sort of victor's justice and so on. There is a legitimate complaint to be made about the Soviet sort of presence at Nuremberg, because the Soviets had done a lot of the same things as the Nazis were being, accused of and convicted of, and for them to then be in the ranks of the accusers is, sometimes a little bit hard to swallow. And of course, they even tried to get, for example, the Katyn massacres onto the German charge sheet, which was a massacre they'd committed against the Polish officer class in 1940. Thankfully, that was blocked by the Allies. But that shows you the kind of the cynicism and the hypocrisy that is going on at some level in Nuremberg.
I guess the counter, not that I would defend, the Soviet atrocities, if you actually read about them.
Yeah, horrific.
Horrific, absolutely horrific, awful. But I guess, given the contribution that the Soviets made to defeating Germany, it was going to be hard to keep them out, not least because Stalin's got his bloody troops all over Eastern Europe, so you're kind of in a...
No, it would have been, but it's just that, that
on a purely moral principle level,
and having the attempt to put the Katyn massacres on the German charge sheet is pretty astonishing cynicism. So that's an angle that perhaps we should bear in mind. This aspect, the wider aspect of sort of victor's justice, I think you see in Nuremberg the first real widespread realization of the true horror of Nazism, which for most people wasn't entirely clear before. You had sort of isolated incidents that they knew about. They knew about the Holocaust, for example, from really late 41 onwards. But very often in sort of piecemeal examples. And the same thing with the horrors of the concentration camps, which is largely a separate issue to the Holocaust. They're linked, but they're kind of separate. So by the time you get to 45, 46 with the Nuremberg trials, people are beginning to put together the mass of evidence that has been, piecemeal evidence that has been, gathered in the meantime, and put it together into a coherent whole, arguably for the first time. So that realization of the true horror of Nazism is something I think that colours a lot of the decision making, and there's a growing assumption, I think, and on behalf of the the Western judges and prosecutors as well, that just sees German and Nazi as synonymous, as they're all equally guilty, they're all equally barbarian. There's a real I say hatred even that comes into the proceedings at that point. So that's an element of Nuremberg that I think is interesting. It's noticeable when you had what we might call the lesser Nurembergs, the other trials that go on, the Krupp trial, the Foreign Office trial, and so on, that go on into the 1950s. The desire to execute those found guilty diminishes as time goes on. And yet, as we know, the vast majority of the defendants at Nuremberg were executed. So I think that's testament to that, realization of that horror in 1945-46, which then sort of dissipates and other factors kick in. The need to sort of rebuild Germany, the need to create a stable Germany in the heart of Europe. The desire for revenge dissipates as time goes on.
Why is your managed retirement account still using strategies that haven't changed in over 5 decades? Most IRAs, 401ks and TSPs are still using the default 60-40 strategy because it benefits corporations, not you. If you have over $50,000 in retirement savings, get instant access to a free 2-minute report from Augusta Precious Metals that reveals how to take control of your financial future in one step. Visit triggergold.com or text TRIGGER to 35052 today.
So let's look at the end of the war, because the way you talk about it in the book is Hitler's suicide was incredibly sudden, and people were taken aback, particularly U-boat commanders.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a fascinating moment. The U-boats themselves had been, as I said, up against it really since 43. So they'd sort of seen their horizons shrink, from the point at which, 42, they were going right across the Atlantic. They were attacking the American eastern seaboard, for example. There were U-boats that went to raid Allied vessels in, the Indian Ocean. So they were really, it's a global operation in the middle of the war. And then by the end, you're sort of shrunk back to the point at which, German U-boats can barely exit the North Sea, right? So there is a sort of growing realization that something's coming, this isn't going to be good, but precisely what shape it's going to take, nobody knows, right? So yeah, Hitler's suicide, when it's announced, is a shock, and a lot of those crews, for a lot of them, it's a relief because they think, okay, well, this will hasten the end, and we might get home. For a lot of them, if they're more ideological, it would be considered tragic, that your great leader had died, or a disillusion. There's a couple of accounts in there with people saying, well, here's this man that led us up the mountain, and he's abandoned us, right? He's shown himself to not be the heroic figure that we thought he was. So you've got a complete spectrum of opinion in that moment. But what follows is interesting, because you've got Dönitz actually succeeds Hitler as head of state in a sort of, rump Nazi administration. And he gives an order for the U-boat force to essentially surrender. Which to most of those commanders is seen as, a sort of dishonorable end. They don't want to give away their, valuable weapon of the U-boat itself. They don't want to surrender that to the enemy. They'd rather scuttle it. They'd rather sink it themselves. So a lot of them do. A lot of, there's examples of naval recruits, for example, running away from training in that period because, the war's over, just go home.
Yeah.
So the whole edifice is kind of falling apart. But that
there are a few, Roger, sorry to interrupt, take the lovely U-boat to Argentina, South America, a few of those as well.
Yeah, there's a couple. I mean, there's a few of these examples, which is interesting because they, this idea of them surrendering to the Allies sticks in the craw of a lot of commanders. This isn't how it should be done. So a lot of them, in a curious twist, actually, that they actually consult their crews. So it becomes a kind of democratic exercise, which you wouldn't imagine in a dictatorship. But the commanders sort of say, well, what do you want to do? What should we do? Because we've been told to surrender to the Allies. That's dishonorable. We don't want to do that. So what should we do? And there are some that sort of say, well, sail to a neutral country. We'll go to a neutral country. We might be able to escape the worst effects of imprisonment and interrogation, all the rest of it. So some of them go to Sweden, some try to go to Portugal, for example. And a couple of them, as you say, end up getting to Argentina in the erroneous assumption that they're going to get a favorable reception. Of course, Argentina had declared war on Germany, I think in February of 45, belatedly. So that particular piece of news had not reached them. They thought they were going to a neutral country. And those two, one of them being, I think, U-977, which is the last one, it actually arrives in August 1945. So really late. And it's a remarkable voyage, so they sort of set off, and I think they're still in the North Atlantic when they're told to surrender. And they basically say, we're not doing that. So against orders, they basically sail south. No plans, no maps, to go for where they would need to get to. Not enough food either. They spend most of the trip submerged, which is horrific. So just to give a bit of detail, in that particular account, they talk about watching the mold grow on the inside of the U-boat, up the inside of the bulkheads and so on, because everything's so damp. They're going through the tropics, so everything's so damp. If you're submerged, you can't get rid of feces. So a lot of that is just kind of stored in the boat. So that's an added element to the U-boat stink. So that's a particularly horrific voyage. And when they actually get to Argentina, and they are duly, taken into custody by the Argentine authorities, as they should be, the commander sort of says to his crew, now we have to surrender, but just pat yourselves on the back effectively for what you've done, that you've got here. He says we had another 3 months of freedom. And in terms of seamanship, what you've done is astonishing. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he says to them, and it is astonishing.
Because there was some stories that you highlighted in the book. The one that I found very interesting was when the German U-boats were told to surrender to the Soviets.
Yeah,
they as one went, rather not actually. Yeah. Let's go to the British.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, I'm quite aware of what the Soviets would, have in store for them if they surrendered to the Soviets. So they turned around, went the other way. Entirely logical. If you know what the Soviets were going to do to you, and conditions actually for the British and the Americans were pretty good. I mean, the Germans themselves were very worried. A lot of the crews were worried about, what surrender would mean. That they could be, deported to. An uncertain fate. That really didn't happen. I mean, most of the crews were, went through interrogation, went through, whatever processes were deemed necessary by the Allies. Most of them were home by 1947. It was actually not a terribly onerous fate for most of them. And then, of course, bear in mind on the converse that the prisoners that the Soviets had, most of those either died in captivity or that eventually returned in the 1950s, so much later. So treatment of certainly of U-boat crews by the Western Allies was pretty benign, actually.
Roger, it's been great having you on. Congratulations on this book. It's out. We won't know if it's out when this interview is out, before or after, but it's out on October 9th.
That's right.
So if we are releasing this before, then it's out on October 9th. Can't recommend it enough. Your writing is brilliant as well. I mean, obviously hard to read that from a video interview, but I've always enjoyed all the books of yours that I've read, and really, really fascinating stuff. We're going to ask you some questions from our supporters in a moment. Before we do, as you know, we always end with the last question, which is, what's the one thing we're not talking about that we should be?
Before Roger answers a final question at the end of the interview, make sure to head over to our Substack. The link is in the description, where you'll be able to see this. For what reason did the German High Command never realise that the Enigma code had been cracked?
Can you explain the economic relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union?
Was being assigned to a U-boat seen as high status or a death sentence?
Yeah, I've thought about this for a little bit the last few days, and it's a difficult one because I think you are doing a great job of airing a lot of these issues that as you say should be talked about and are not. The one that sort of struck me, and it struck me just actually driving over here today, seeing how many of the Union Jacks and crosses of St. George are still flying. Now, weeks after that, what was it called? Raise the Colours or whatever that operation was called. And I was speaking recently with a friend of mine who I hadn't seen for a few months, and he said, and he's a sort of standard, he describes himself as a centrist, he votes Lib Dem, for God's sake, right? And he said, I'm done. I've been radicalized. His words, I've been radicalized. So what I just would mention in this context of the thing we're not talking about is the radicalization of the centre, or the mobilization of the centre. I think the mass of the British people is a bit like a sort of a large cow. It's kind of bovine. It will put up with a hell of a lot. It will put up with a lot of prodding and provoking. And then at some point it will turn. And I feel like it's kind of turning. And you can see that in the Epping protests. You could see it last year in Southport and so on. I think you can see it with those flag protests the last few weeks or, a couple of months ago. So I think there's something stirring there. And I'm not saying it's worrying, because I think it's kind of, on one level, it's maybe a healthy corrective for British politics, because we've been, under more or less progressive governments really for 10 years to a greater or lesser degree. You raise your eyes, Konstantin.
I'm thinking
I think
97.
I think the last Tory government,
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd go further.
I'd go further.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, fine.
Approaching 20 years at this point, I'd say.
So I think there's a degree to which ordinary people are beginning to think, well, hang on, this narrative of anyone that sort of raises their concern about the nation being bigoted, neo-Nazi or whatever it might be, that they're suddenly going, what, you're talking about us? Like, really?
Well, it's one of the fascinating...
And they're stirring. And I think politics, sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm
but I think politics, it feels like politics a little bit in the last year has shifted almost onto the streets in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah. Which
is kind of fascinating and kind of scary at the same time. So I just wonder where that goes. That could be successfully harnessed by maybe a resurgent Tory party or maybe by reform under Farage, but maybe not. And it just seems to me it's a little bit like uncharted territory.
Well, the only reason I was jumping in is I wanted to very much emphasize why we love talking to historians. When you came in earlier, you were like, you've had a lot of historians on recently. Is that a strategic thing? There's not. We just love historians. Because one of the things it does is it makes you immune to all this stupidity. If you've just listened to a historian talk for an hour about Nazi U-boats, it becomes quite difficult to call a Gary the white van man who just thinks maybe illegal immigration shouldn't be happening a Nazi or far right. Because you go, what are you talking about? Yeah. Right? So I think that's definitely the case. Another thing is, I live in a leafy middle-class part of Kent. There's an England flag or a British flag on every lamppost right now. Yeah. So I don't think it was about one moment in time. I just think it's how a lot of people feel. And they're perfectly entitled to feel that way.
I agree. And that's why I don't view it. I'm not necessarily, putting the writing on the wall in any sense. And making blunt comparisons to this period, because that would be daft.
Right.
But it just strikes me that, particularly with that element of, increasingly seeing politics playing out on the streets, and we saw that, with the Palestinian protests as well, and then more recently with Epping and stuff, that it just strikes me that is an interesting shift, that, it seems to me like uncharted territory. Where does that end up? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's going to be interesting to watch.
All right, this is where all the U-boat nerds are going. Talk about welding. Head on over to Substack, triggerpod.co.uk. We'll talk all about more U-boats.
And welding. I heard that a German U-boat got discovered as the captain flushed a loo roll, causing sewage to return inside and force the crew to the surface near the British coast. Is this true, and are there other ridiculous discovery destruction stories of U-boats?